I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute, and I am honored this morning to be with the Right Honourable Philip Hammond, the UK Foreign Minister, for his speech on energy and climate policy. Thank you for joining us. A few quick words about our guest. Mr. Hammond is the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. He was elected a Conservative Member of Parliament in 1997 and has previously served as the Secretary of State for Transport and Security of State and Defense. Outside of his political career, he's had a business career in small and medium-sized companies from all over the UK economy. We're delighted to hear his remarks about conservative approaches to how we can understand the climate and energy situation. We're also delighted and honored to have with us Sir Peter Westmacott, the British Ambassador to the United States. So with this, we welcome our friend from the UK, the Right Honourable Philip Hammond.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brooks, for your kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here at the American Enterprise Institute. You are rightly regarded as one of the most influential think tanks. The work that you do here has a real-world impact. Papers become policy in Republican and Democrat administrations. I also welcome the AEI board members who are here today. The fact that so many influential and busy individuals regularly take time to come and hear not only from external speakers but also from AEI scholars is testament to your reputation for high quality and relevant work. I haven't come here by chance, I've come here by choice, because I want to make an argument to a conservative audience. First, that it is wholly consistent with conservative values to tackle the challenge of climate change, and second, that those conservative values can show us how best to deal with that challenge. As I said in my speech in Boston last year, for too long we've allowed the debate about climate change to be dominated by purists and idealists, many of whom operate on the left of the political spectrum, who actively promote the notion that they and only they have the answers to the climate challenge, and that we have to sacrifice economic growth and prosperity in order to meet it. I reject those arguments. I reject them, first of all, because wanting to protect the world we inherit, to pass it on intact to the next generation, is a fundamentally conservative instinct. As long ago as 1988, former Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said, and I quote, "The last thing we want is to leave environmental debts for our children to clear up. No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease," unquote. And I reject those arguments, secondly, because I do not accept that we have to choose between our future prosperity and safeguarding the future of our planet. This is not a zero-sum game. As conservatives, we choose both. The starting point for any discussion on climate change must be the threat it poses. Now, of course, no one is 100% certain of every aspect of the science, and no one is 100% certain of the precise effects of man's activity on our climate. But the evidence in favor of taking action to curb carbon emissions has been steadily mounting for decades. Uncertainty about the exact effects of climate change or the role of man's activity in delivering it is not an excuse for inaction. In every other facet of life, we assess the risks, and where the risk of occurrence is high and the impacts are potentially catastrophic, we act to mitigate and to prevent. Our approach to climate change should be no different. That is exactly the precautionary approach that President Reagan took decades ago when the world faced a similar challenge. In the 1980s, the majority of the world's scientists were deeply concerned about the environment, in that case, about the depletion of the ozone layer. There were some doubters, but President Reagan concluded that the risks of doing nothing were too great. It was a core part of his conservative principles to take bold action when necessary. He displayed leadership, galvanizing business and the international community to agree what became the Montreal Protocol to phase out the use of damaging CFCs. President Reagan described it as a magnificent achievement, and he was right to do so. We now know the worried scientists were right, and as a result of the protocol, the ozone layer is now recovering. I recognize the concerns of those who worry that the cost of tackling climate change will prove too great, that the attempts to do so might ruin our economy. This is a reasonable concern. And if it really was a choice between economic growth on the one hand or lower greenhouse gas emissions on the other, then I too would be cautious. But I shall argue that it is not. And in doing so, the first thing I need to stress is that the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. Nearly a decade ago, the then UK government commissioned a review by one of our leading economists, Nicholas Stern, to ask what the cost of doing nothing might be. That review estimated that it could be equivalent to losing 20% of global consumption. Since then, as our knowledge has developed, we've come to see this as not only an underestimate, but also a narrow way of looking at the problem. Many of the losses caused by climate change could be irreversible, regardless of our resources. Unchecked climate change, even under the most likely scenario, could have catastrophic consequences, a rise in global temperatures similar to the difference between the last ice age and today, leading in turn to rising sea levels, huge movements of people fueling conflict and instability, pressure on resources, and a multitude of new risks to global public health. The worst case is even more severe, a drastic change in our environment that could see heat stress in some areas surpass the limits of human tolerance, leaving as the legacy of our generation an unimaginably different and more dangerous world for our children and our grandchildren. So the costs of doing nothing are potentially catastrophic, beyond anything that can easily be quantified in economic terms. But even that argument would be vulnerable if the immediate cost of taking the necessary actions was economically ruinous. So the second thing we need to consider is what really are the costs of the necessary action. And we should be honest. We should not pretend that acting on climate change does not involve hard choices. Even as the economy as a whole has more to gain than to lose from embracing the low-carbon agenda, there will be losers. Some sectors, particularly coal, are in for a difficult time, and we will need to think carefully about how we manage the impact on communities that have depended on these industries for generations. Their contribution to our economies has been a great one, and we should not abandon them now. However, the more we learn, the more the evidence is shifting in favor of action, because that evidence is showing that many of the measures to reduce climate risk will, in fact, stimulate economic growth. Our experience in the UK bears this out. We've already reduced our emissions by more than a quarter since 1990, and over the same period of time, our economy has grown by more than 60%. Just last year, we registered a reduction in the carbon intensity of our economy of more than 10%, the steepest drop achieved by any country in the last 6 years. At the same time, we had the fastest economic growth rate in the G7. Not only that, but the growth in the low-carbon sector of the UK economy is now outpacing the growth rate of the economy as a whole. In the UK, firms engaged in low-carbon goods and services employed over 460,000 people and contributed £45 billion to the UK economy in 2013. This is an increase of almost 30% in just 3 years. And the global trends are in the same direction. The global low-carbon economy is already worth $6 trillion and is growing at between 4 and 5% a year. In 2013, additions to the world's renewable energy generating capacity exceeded those to the fossil fuel capacity for the first time ever. And the price of renewable generation is falling fast. The price of solar panels has fallen by 80% since 2008, and the price of wind turbines has fallen by more than a quarter since 2009. This is increasingly allowing these energy sources to compete on cost with fossil-fueled power generation without the need for subsidy. Our businesses in the UK are looking at these trends, and they're telling us that we should be a leader, not a back marker, that we should be at the forefront of these developments, taking advantage of the opportunities. The final argument against tackling climate change that I want to address today is the argument that if we take action, it will put us at a disadvantage to competitors who don't. Again, this is a perfectly reasonable concern. But with countries representing 85% of the world's emissions signed up to national contribution targets ahead of COP21 in Paris, the reality is all significant potential competitors are now headed in the same direction. And in any case, the UK's experience so far is that a robust climate policy, even during a period when others have been uncommitted, has had no noticeable impact on our overall competitiveness. Businesses remain attracted to the UK's openness to investment, flexible labour markets, and highly skilled workforce. In fact, it is increasingly clear that the economy of the future will be a low-carbon economy. Studies suggest that by stimulating greater innovation and efficiency, climate policies will increase our economic competitiveness. 2 weeks ago, I was in the United Arab Emirates, giving a speech on climate change, as it happens. They have the world's 7th largest reserves of gas and oil. Despite this, they are already planning for a future without hydrocarbons. They're investing in some of the world's largest solar power plants and are at the forefront of innovation in technologies such as high-efficiency solar-powered desalination. And that is not only happening in the Middle East. China is now the world's leading investor in renewable energy. In the next 5 years alone, it will add more wind power than the entire generating capacity from all sources of the UK. China has efficiency standards for its vehicles similar to those of Europe and America, and woe betide the Chinese official who rigs the tests, and is increasingly planning its cities to be low carbon and resource efficient. 7 regions of China are already putting a price on carbon, and in another 2 years this will have spread to cover the whole of the country. So in summary, the world is moving towards a low-carbon economy. I would suggest that there may now be more risk in being left behind than there is in taking the lead. The threat is great, and the costs of dealing with it are now manageable. But the question remains how best to respond to the challenge. What are the appropriate mechanisms? What are the conservative solutions? How best can we tackle the principal cause of climate change, carbon emissions? Of course, there are those on the left who have seen the need for action on climate change as a justification for large-scale mobilization, for a regulatory bonanza and a bigger state. And if a purely regulatory approach was the answer, I have no doubt that economic growth would suffer. But it isn't. The answer, as even the Chinese have realized, is to harness the power of the marketplace, to let the hidden hand of market forces loose on the challenge we are facing, and watch it deliver solutions as it has delivered solutions to every other problem we have faced and resolved in our history. We should be well placed in this regard. Free markets have shaped both our countries. New York and London host the world's 2 most important stock exchanges. London, New York, and Chicago, the world's most important commodity exchanges. And it's my confidence in markets that drives my approach to the economics of climate change. In the UK, we've placed a price on carbon. This is completely in line with conservative economic values. A carbon price corrects a market failure, that we've allowed CO2 emissions to be a free good to the polluter, even though they impose costs on society. With any other waste, we pay for it to be taken away. We do not let people just dump it on the street. Moreover, A market solution is simple and gives business the certainty that they're asking for. Alongside 70 governments, over 1,000 businesses signed a declaration calling for carbon pricing last year. And rather than waiting for government, many businesses are taking matters into their own hands by bringing in an internal carbon price to guide their investment decisions. The number of multinational businesses taking this approach has tripled over the past 12 months, tripled. Even oil companies, including BP, Shell, Statoil and Total, have come out in favor of carbon pricing. Major US companies that either already use internal carbon pricing or intend to introduce it within the next 2 years include Google, Microsoft, American Express, Coca-Cola, Monsanto, Walmart and Yahoo. And fundamental to a market-based approach is letting our entrepreneurs and our innovators show the way. Your organization is dedicated to preserving and strengthening the foundations of a free society, including competitive private enterprise. I agree wholeheartedly with that aim. Far too often, business is cast in the role of villain when it comes to climate change. But as Margaret Thatcher, you know I'm a British Tory because I keep quoting Margaret Thatcher, but as Margaret Thatcher said in her speech to the UN General Assembly back in 1989, we must resist the simplistic tendency to blame modern multinational industry for the damage which is being done to the environment. Far from being the villains, it is them on whom we rely to do the research and find the solutions. And she could have added, make the investments. And again, the UK and the US are well placed to lead. We have some of the most innovative businesses, and our entrepreneurs are already leading the way. For example, UK firms build more Formula One racing cars than any other country. And they're pushing the boundaries of technology to harness the energy from braking and release it back into acceleration through electric motors. The US firm Tesla is leading the world in developing battery technology for road cars and increasingly for homes too, giving them independence from the grid and moving us closer to the time when renewable generation is matched by effective storage to give round-the-clock access to renewable power. We have the best research institutions in the world. If you look at a list of the top universities in the world, you will find that last year, all of the top 10 were either British or American. And by the way, we think that the 4-6 split, UK-US, is pretty reasonable, given your population is 5 times ours. The UK leads the world in offshore wind energy. We've installed more capacity than any other country in the world, and this is increasingly creating jobs as firms export their products and services. Meanwhile, companies such as Google are leading in developing the big data capabilities, which will allow the supply and demand for energy to be matched more intelligently, reducing waste and cost. I believe that our countries need to accelerate the pace of innovation in all of these technologies. In particular, we should focus on crossing the critical frontier of large-scale, high-efficiency energy storage, giving the prospect of cost-effective renewable storage not just round the clock, but through the seasons. If our innovators and entrepreneurs can solve this challenge and bring the cost of clean energy with storage below the cost of fossil fuel power generation, then the need for intervention will have passed, and we can step back and leave the market to do the rest. Renewables will become the energy of choice, clean, competitive, and secure. If we take all of this action, we will reduce the cost of energy and the risks of climate change. We will create jobs and enhance our energy security. So if Britain and the US move ahead, we can reap the rewards. But of course, we cannot solve climate change alone. Only effective global action will achieve that. That's why the international community is negotiating right now what I hope will be a strong, effective and binding deal at the Paris meeting next month. The Paris deal is important because it will give all countries confidence in the direction of travel. It will level the playing field. confirm once and for all that climate action does not create competitive disadvantage, catalyse investment, and spur innovation. Over 150 countries have already made commitments to reduce their emissions over time ahead of the Paris meeting. It is likely that every significant country in the world will have done so by the end of this year. And these are not just rhetorical commitments. Many include strong, substantive elements, such as China's commitment for clean energy sources to make up a fifth of its energy consumption by 2030. Independent analysis estimates that this commitment could give China a renewable energy capacity of 1,000 gigawatts by 2030, roughly equivalent to the United States' total electricity generating capacity today. This huge increase will fundamentally change world energy markets by expanding economies of scale and accelerating technological innovation. Our history shows us that when the US and the UK take a lead, we can persuade the world to follow, and we must take that lead. Through our world-beating innovation, our trust in markets, and our leadership on the world stage, we can show the world how to counter the threat of climate change at the same time as growing our economies. As conservatives, we know the responsible thing to do is tackle threats when we see them, and to do so in ways which preserve our future security and prosperity. And we know the smart thing to do is harness the power of the market to tackle the challenges of climate change. Because if we do not lead, others will decide the way forward, and their solutions may not be conservative ones. But if we do take the lead, we can ensure the global response is founded on the force of markets, the power of technology, and the institutions of capitalism. To get there, leadership is required, and not just that of government. Think tanks, academia, businesses, all have a crucial role to play. The papers you write here at AEI, the policies you promote, the investments businesses make, all of these things together will determine whether and how we choose to address the challenge of climate change. Taking action to combat climate change is the right thing to do, the conservative thing to do, and we have the power to ensure that as the world embraces the challenge, it does so by harnessing the power of markets and the institutions of capitalism, the very things that have delivered for us time and time again throughout our history. I look forward to working with you to seize this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My mic up? Good. Thank you so much. What an honor it is to have you here, and thank you for your remarks, your very frank remarks about this incredibly important issue. I'm going to moderate a question and answer with the period with the audience. I'm not going to take the prerogative very much myself, except for one question. So I'd like you to get your questions in your mind, and then I'll call on you for the foreign minister. But I'd like to start by asking a question that's of particular concern to a lot of people in this audience about this. Since we were children in the United States, we've seen a tremendous improvement in the environment in the United States. I grew up on the West Coast. I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, and it's remarkably better than it was. And there is a cost to that, to be sure, but the Americans have, and people from all around the world, have decided to have a cleaner environment and have paid for that. And we see what a better world it is. But when we look at the rest of the world, it's not always the same case. I want a cleaner environment personally, but the number one issue for me personally is world poverty. I spend a lot of time outside the United States in communities that are really very, very poor. I came back over the weekend from India, where I was shooting a film for AEI in a slum in Mumbai. And when I was there, I was working with, and I was talking to people who recycle plastic. They take the plastic water bottles and they turn them into other products by melting them down. And one of the people I was with told me an interesting story. He showed me bags of old water bottles and pieces of plastic, and he said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's trash." And he said, "No, that's wrong. That's opportunity." He said that something in your house you threw away because you thought it was trash. It came here, we recycle it, turn it into another product, and it goes back into your house, and every link of that chain is somebody's dream. He said, and I said, "But that's fantastic. That's the most conservative thing ever. You and I love this, I expect." I said, "What's the problem?" He says, "The problem is that your country wants to shut us down." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "There's smoke that comes out of here, and there's pressure from the American and European governments on the Indian government to shut down this entire industry and thus to shut down the dreams of these people who are dirt poor. They were dying of starvation under Nehruvian socialism and under Indira Gandhi, and now for the first time they're being set free." I completely share your views that we need a cleaner environment. What do I tell the poor man in Dharavi who's simply trying to make a living and feed his family for the very first time? Is there a solution that's compatible with this when the largest part of the carbon emissions in the world are not coming from Great Britain, they're not coming from the United States, they're coming from China and India, where people are simply trying not to be poor?
Well, I think first of all we have to recognise that some of the there is a challenge here, there is a conundrum, but we have to recognise that some of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, that will actually suffer the most if there is catastrophic climate change, are those poorest countries in the world. If we have catastrophic climate change, heat stress making large parts of the world uninhabitable, rising sea levels, it will not be the rich countries that suffer. We will be able belatedly to invest in the protections we need to survive those things. It will be the poorest, least capable countries, the poorest, least capable populations that will suffer the most. But look, I'm not an expert on recycling of plastics, but I'm pretty sure that the answer to your question is that there are ways of recycling plastic bottles. We do it all the time in our own economies, which are consistent with addressing the climate change goals as well. And it's about creating an industry and a structure of industry that can respond to that. That probably means that your guys in Mumbai are going to become collectors and merchants selling on their mashed up plastic bottles to a processor who's then going to process them in a higher technology plant than they would ever be able to afford. That doesn't mean they're out of business, it just means their business is changing. And I think that there's a real danger, whether we're talking about a developed economy or a developing economy, in looking at a single industry or a single sector. Of course there's a temptation, let's take the US, to focus on the coal industry and the significant importance of the coal industry and the impact on the coal industry of delivering carbon reduction targets. That is, with respect, the wrong starting point. We have to look at the costs and benefits to the whole economy. What I've tried to get across this morning is that, looked at on a whole economy basis, the opportunities to drive economic growth through embracing these new technologies allow us to mitigate the impacts on those who suffer loss and negative effect as older industries, polluting industries, are negatively impacted by this change. The question for me is, looked at across the economy as a whole, is the impact positive or negative overall? How you then manage the allocation of those impacts between different sectors, different groups, different individuals is a challenge for governments and markets of getting the structures right. And I think we can do that, provided the overall impact is positive.
Recently, I was speaking to a supporter of AEI who works in the fossil fuel industry, and I asked about the very questions that you raise. I said, "Well, what's the answer?" Because he was as concerned as anybody in this room about having a clean environment that's sustainable and it looks to the future in a way that's best for all people, and particularly future generations. And I said, "What's the answer?" And I mean, there are lots of, and he gave me an example of the wrong way of going about it, which is to say, to create winners and losers where we don't have perfect information and perfect science. And so he gave me an example of ethanol, where we grow food and then burn it. But we have to subsidize it a lot, and it turns out to have a higher carbon footprint, and it burns food and drives up food prices, which again hurts the poor. And I said, what's your point? He said, the point is, if we simply took off all of the taxes and all of the subsidies and all of the regulatory environment that distorts the prices for fuels, then the highest benefit, lowest cost methods would come forward. And within 20 years, we would have a lower carbon environment. Is this correct, or is this simply pie in the sky thinking?
Well, I think there are a number of different arguments mixed up together there. I think we have to. I mentioned the issue of market failure around the ability to dump pollution without charge. If there is no cost imposed on at the level of the firm, the individual, then his behaviours don't reflect the social costs of what he's doing. And where we have a market failure that allows people to do things like that, just as going back to your opening point, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we regarded it as normal to dump into rivers the effluent from industrial production. We would not regard that as acceptable or normal now. It's allowing somebody to make a cost-benefit analysis that is distorted by viewing only their private costs and benefits and not the broader costs and benefits they impose on the society. So having a pricing mechanism that embraces all aspects of the activity is vitally important. I think what I'm arguing here, and what I said earlier on, is that if we can get a little bit further down the road of technological development that we're currently embarked upon, we are getting to the point where many of these technologies will not need special regimes, protections, subsidies. The technology itself will have developed to the point where unit costs are competitive with fossil fuels. Solar power is already competitive with fossil fuels in most parts of the world, not just in the Sahara Desert, but in most parts of the world. The next challenge is being able to store it, because clearly solar power is only available at certain parts of the day. If we can crack the challenge, and this is a technological challenge, it's is it as difficult as putting a man on the moon? I don't think so. But cracking the challenge of being able to store energy round the clock will give us solar power as a market competitive form of energy in vast parts of the world. It will allow countries in the equatorial regions in particular, countries in the Middle East, to export electricity in the future in the way that other countries now export oil and gas. It will give them a source of economic activity, a source of income that could be very significant for their development. So the question is how we foster and encourage that next step of innovation. It should be market-led, but there will be a need in some cases for short-term interventions to stimulate the market in the right direction.
I'm going to turn it over to the audience now. I would like to hear what's on your mind. House rules. Wait for the microphone, say your name, and put your protest statement in the form of a question. John, do you have one back here? We're running slightly short. Okay, so one or two questions, and we'll have shorter answers. We'll start right up here. Can we take the mic over here?
Good morning, sir. Welcome.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. As conservatives, we tend to value the proven and the trusted. I heard no discussion of nuclear energy in your talk, and it looks as though Europe is largely walking away from it. Is that true?
Well, the UK certainly isn't. We're embarked on a program of reinvestment in nuclear power as our last generation of nuclear power stations come to the end of their lives. We are replacing them, and we are very clear that nuclear has to be part of the future clean energy mix. We will never get to the targets we have set ourselves without nuclear providing a significant element of the electricity generation baseload. Other countries in Europe have different positions on this, and there is frankly, a political challenge. Germany, most notoriously, I suppose is the right word, has committed to ending its dependence on nuclear energy. We think that is misjudged, but we are, the British government's position is that while European countries through the European Union must make commitments collectively to reducing our carbon footprint, individual nations should choose how to do that. If the Germans want to cripple themselves by doing it in a less efficient way, that has to be their right to choose that. They're not the only ones, but they're the biggest economy that's focusing on a non-nuclear future. We are clear that we will have a significant element of nuclear in our mix.
Right in the back here. Yes, sir.
Hello, I'm Thomas Ward. I was a former economist at the World Bank, and the bank just put out a new report that there's going to be a new climate social network as well. And my question is how are we going to pay for all this? Is it through the Paris, climate change, and you're looking at Exxon and others getting taxed now and looking at climate problems coming out of New York?
By the way, you've just reminded me, a point I meant to make in response to you. Of course, talking about fossil fuel companies is kind of misleading because most of these companies are also players in the renewable energy sector
That's
now.
true.
And they see themselves as integrated providers of energy solutions looking into the future. Let me interpret your question as I haven't seen this World Bank report that you referred to, but there is a requirement as part of the COP21 negotiation to mobilize eye-wateringly large amounts of finance for a global climate initiative, $100 billion a year by the end of the decade. And it's clear that to bring the developing world with us, we have to be able to demonstrate how we are going to mobilize the kind of resource that is necessary to deliver this agenda. But again, very important to emphasize, this is not $100 billion of donated money or $100 billion of public funding. It's $100 billion of capital mobilized behind the investment programs that are needed to tackle these challenges. And much of this money will be invested by businesses as a business proposition in response to the clear commitments that governments have made to decarbonize their economies. We see it in our own economy. We set the parameters. We've done it in the simplest way. We've just told the electricity distribution companies that X percentage of the power they distribute has to come from renewable sources. How they deliver that is up to them. And of course, that has placed a premium on the value of renewable energy generated, sold into the grid at the beginning, because there was a deficit of renewable energy. As the quantity of renewable energy being generated has increased in line with what you would expect the marketplace to do, that premium has declined because there is now something closer to a balance between the demand from the energy distributors to meet their statutory obligations and the supply of renewable energy into the grid.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this period, and the foreign minister has to go on to his next appointment. I'm delighted to have him here, and I'm thankful to all of you for coming to this session, and I would like to invite you to join me in thanking Foreign Minister Philip Hammond. Thank you.